Thanks, Dan. Great to see all of you, or at least see your pictures, and some of you with just initials. Very, very much appreciate being invited to chat here. I'm going to try to share my screen, and who knows what will happen after that. How'd that go?
That's
Can anyone
there.
tell me? It's
That's
there.
perfect.
Is it full? Okay. Is it full screen? Does that work? Okay.
That's perfect.
Okay. Great. Okay. Well, let me. Oh, of course that didn't work. Let's try this here, and there we go. Okay. So maybe what I'll do to start, I'll try to get through this relatively quickly so we can have time for some questions. Some of what I talk about today will be old news to a lot of you, and some of it won't be. So I'm going to go over some stuff that I think many of you already know, and I apologize for that in advance. I couldn't figure out a way to have this presentation without talking through some of the detail. But why don't I take a minute and step back and just explain how I come to this conversation. I am a partner at a place called Social Capital Partners. It was founded 20 years ago by my partner, Bill Young. The idea of Social Capital Partners is how do we find ways to marry a business focus and a business incentives and doing good. So Bill had done really well in the private sector, and 20 years ago said, I want to spend the rest of my career focused on something else. I think the world has paid me enough for what I've contributed. I have found that the systems in place are very well set up for me and not very well set up for everybody else. And so I want to spend the rest of my career thinking about how do I use my time and my money to come up with new models and new incentives that create different outcomes. And over the course of about 15 years, came up with a bunch of really interesting ideas, a lot of which worked and a lot of which were very thoughtful. Well, they were all very thoughtful, some of which worked. And I'd say, one that I like to talk about is he would lend money to franchises in exchange for those franchises hiring people from their community through community service organizations, which generally help people facing barriers to employment find good jobs. The focus of Social Capital Partners was all on the income side. How do we help people who don't have access to good jobs find good jobs? And what they did is they made these loans to franchises. In exchange for the loans, the franchises committed to hiring from community services organizations locally. And if they were successful, their interest rate would go down by 1%, and it could go as low as 0. So Bill was effectively using a social finance tool, a way to use finance to incent different behavior. It was very successful. 500 people got jobs through this program. I joined about 5 years ago. I brought on a colleague here as well at the time. And we started talking about the objectives that we had around wealth inequality, saying, if what we're trying to do here is broaden outcomes for people in society, if we only focus on income, we may be only addressing some of the problem. Because the other side of wealth inequality is assets and ownership, which of course the people in this room would know well. And we said, okay, we can be the only, because we're independently funded, we can do what we want. We can be the only group that focuses on ownership, where usually charities, nonprofits, governments focus on income. And so we looked around the world for all of the different really good mechanisms that have been created that transfer ownership to a broader set of people. And, from CoOps to, all sorts of different ideas. And we ended up coming upon the ESOP in the US, which of course, again, many in this room really know well, but we didn't know about the ESOP. And we were amazed by the impact that the ESOP had in the US in broadening ownership, right? So 14 million Americans have ESOP plans with $1.4 trillion or so in collected wealth through those plans. And they wouldn't have had to pay for those shares, which we think is incredibly important. So we have dedicated ourselves to doing two things at SCP. One is we are trying to connect Canadian pension fund money to the United States ESOP community to help larger ESOPs happen in the US. And our first deal on that was the Taylor Guitars deal last year, where that company sold to its 1,400 employees in a financing that was led by us, with the majority of the capital coming from the Healthcare of Ontario pension plan. So that's sort of one part of our work. And the other was to advocate for more employee ownership up in Canada. Obviously this group has done great work in bringing some employee ownership to Canada, but on a macro level, we have much, much, much less employee ownership than they do in the US, and now much less than in the UK, because the UK has brought employee ownership to that country. They brought it in 2014. We'll talk more about that. But so what we've set out to do is say, okay, well, let's learn everything we can about the ESOP in the US. Let's learn everything we can about the employee ownership trust model in the UK and see what we can do in terms of bringing something similar here to Canada. And of course, I understand that those efforts have been done in the past, by some of the folks even in this room, but it hadn't been done in a little while. And so that's what we set ourselves to doing. So that's SCP. And I'll just move the page here. So first, let me just explain what it is we mean when we say employee ownership and when we say employee ownership trusts. So Dan introduced this as our effort to bring employee ownership trusts to Canada. And for us, that means a combination of the US model and the UK model. So the problem with the ESOP, as you would know about quite well, is people in Canada think that means stock option plan. And we couldn't introduce this as an ESOP because it would be too confusing. So we use the UK term employee ownership trust, even though we don't mean specifically the UK version. So it's based on a combination of the ESOP model in the UK, or the ESOP model in the US and the EOT model in the UK. The way we are discussing this is as a new dedicated legal trust in Canada to allow for the transfer of ownership to one's employees. The elements of the US and the UK model that are critical to, we believe, a successful model include that these trusts own shares on behalf of all employees and that employees do not pay for their shares, which is what makes employee ownership so accessible in the US and the UK and what has led to all of the amazing outcomes that we'll talk about a bit later. Obviously there are trusts in Canada that exist today that try to do some version of this, but there are issues. We have studied all 32 or 31 trusts that are available in Canada. There are issues with each of them, whether it's the 21-year rule, whether it's when things are taxed, whether it's ability to take on debt, whether it's the ability to hold shares on behalf of employees. There's all sorts of issues that prevent a US or UK version of this being, well, I wouldn't say being possible, but certainly being doable without a lot of heavy lifting. And so our position has been, if we want to scale employee ownership in Canada in the same way it's been done in the US and the UK, we need a new model, and we needed to deal with all of these issues that are in place today. That advocacy over the last couple of years, it started in October of 2020 when we introduced a report called Building an Employee Ownership Economy. We met with a bunch of politicians over the last couple of years, leading to this last budget about, 7 weeks ago now, where the government of Canada committed to bringing a version of an employee ownership trust here to Canada. Now, this is the structure that the US and the UK model uses. How it works in those places is an ESOP trust is set up. Debt is arranged. In the UK, it's almost exclusively financed by the owners themselves. In the US, it's often a combination of owner financing and bank financing, and then sometimes people like us who show up randomly. The purchase is completed through the use of a trustee, and then the company pays down debt over time. In the UK, the way it works is it's a profit sharing model. So each year, whatever excess cash is available gets paid out to employees on equal terms, not equal amounts, but on equal terms. And in the US, which is a share-based model, shares are allocated over time to all employees. And then when the employee leaves, they get paid. And that's sort of this part on the end here, where just in the US, those shares are then allocated to individuals, and then those shares are repurchased from individuals when they leave. There's a lot of detail in there, which I can answer. I don't know what's known and what isn't known, so I'll just kind of go over this stuff relatively quickly. This is the level of success in the US and the UK. The US part of it may be more well known in terms of both the companies, the Publixes and the Bob's Red Mills and the Davy Trees and the Taylor Guitars and Gore-Tex, etc. I think there's been some media on those over the years, and so I think they're somewhat well known. I think the success in the UK is less well known. So as I said before, the UK brought this in 2014 with some incentives. The primary incentive is that owners who sell to an EOT in the UK pay no capital gains tax. And then there's a small incentive for employees in terms of lowering the tax on the dividends that they get through profit sharing. But what's amazing is how quickly it scaled, right? So the UK has had some version of trusts available over the years. The John Lewis Partnership exists and is quite large. There would have been whatever, a certain number in the 100 to 200 range of employee-owned companies when this was brought in. But last year alone, 210 companies sold to their employees in the UK, showing the importance of a dedicated structure for these programs and associated tax incentives for these programs. So I think the UK has been super helpful in demonstrating the scalability of this model with the right structure. In the US, there's been a ton of research on the virtue of employee-owned companies, given that there are the 6,500 of them. They've been around for 50 odd years, and the number of employees. There is a research organization at Rutgers that studies this on an ongoing basis. And so we know these things to be true that are on this chart. We know that employee ownership increases employee wealth on average by 92%. Those results are even stronger when you look specifically at people of color and women. We know that it creates economic resilience in that employee-owned companies perform better in downturns. We know it protects local and regional jobs. For us, part of the rationale for getting involved in this is the knowledge that so many businesses are going to sell over the next 10 to 15 years. They are primarily going to sell to private equity companies or competitors. Those private equity companies are primarily going to be American. How do we keep jobs in Canada? How do we keep them local? How do we keep them from being consolidated? And finally, around business succession, again, with all of these transitions to come, having this as an option is just a good thing. Owners, the more choice that owners have in terms of selling their company, the better. And this is certainly a choice that's been proven to work in a couple of other countries. I'd say one of the things that we've been surprised by is the amount in our conversations with politicians where the Canadian ownership has been really meaningful. So politicians of all stripes have said, I'm really excited by how this is likely to keep jobs or keep companies in Canada. And that wasn't even one of our initial points, even though we know it to be true. We thought more about local jobs and wealth creation and resilience, et cetera. But the Canadian part of this has been very powerful, which is great. I mean, it's the right thing to be thinking about. And so that's been a real motivator for politicians that have gotten behind this. And which has led to kind of the budget action. So as you'll see here, I'm not going to read through it, but on the left-hand side of your screen is 2001's budget language, which was initial and promising, where it said we're going to study this issue. And then, of course, this year's, which committed to bringing an employee ownership trust as a new dedicated trust under the income tax to Canada. We'll get to what this all means in a couple of pages, but again, I want to go relatively quickly so we can get to the interesting questions on all of this. But this is now a commitment by the federal government to do this, and that commitment has been backed up by a number of other stakeholders. So although I don't know how much weight it holds anymore, the Conservative platform of 2021 included in it a commitment to not only bring employee ownership trusts to Canada, but to provide tax incentives for their use. In Ontario, two parties, both of whom likely to serve in opposition in some capacity, the Liberals and the NDP, have come out in favor of adding benefits in Ontario to employee ownership trusts when they become relevant. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council of Canada, both relatively conservative organizations, have come out in favor, as well as the Bank of Montreal. Now, the Bank of Montreal is a large lender to ESOP-owned companies in the US. They're probably one of the top three, alongside JP Morgan and somebody else, Bank of America, I think, who are the main lenders to employee ownership in the US. So BMO has a ton of experience with this and is really interested in seeing it in place in Canada. And then on the bottom right, you'll see John Stackhouse, who is a very influential person, used to be editor of the Globe and Mail, has come out strongly in favor of employee ownership trusts in Canada, and he's sort of the spokesperson for RBC CEO. So there's a ton of sort of support for this among the business community and among the political class, which has led to a number of good articles, right, for us in the press, and some of which I've outlined here. Matt Lundy's at the top back in September really raised the profile of this issue as something that politicians were supporting. And then in the run up to the, or just past the budget, there were a few articles in the Star and the Post. Benefits Canada has written about this, as you might imagine, as you might expect them to, a number of times over the past year. And then there were, I was on The Current with Matt Galloway, which was a life highlight for me, but pretty good for us in terms of advocacy, a few weeks ago, and talking about what this might mean for the country. We're, the way we like to talk about it is we say if this is implemented well and designed properly, we would expect, given the experience in the US and the UK, there to be hundreds of companies that convert to employee ownership over the next decade, leading to tens of thousands of employees owning hundreds of millions of dollars of shares in their firms, which of course we believe is very exciting and on mission in terms of broadening ownership in the economy. And the only thing that sort of, and sorry, here I'll just add one more thing. In March of 2021, the CFIB put a poll in the field, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, of whom some of you may be members, asking what their membership thought about employee ownership trusts, giving a very short description of what they are and what they might mean, with some very positive results. And one of the things we asked that we thought would be interesting is, what do people care about when they think about selling their business? And the thing that people cared about most was protecting employees, even more than the highest possible price, which we expected. I mean, I've been a business owner and I have sold businesses, so it wouldn't come as a surprise to me, but it was good to have that backed up with data. And then the CFIB just put out a new poll, which we didn't know about until this morning, that asked what business owners thought about some of the things that were in the most recent budget. And I think it was 73% of people were very, very happy to see employee ownership trusts in it, with only 5% of people saying it was bad. How a business owner would think this is bad, I don't know, but they may be grumpy people that say they don't like anything. I don't know. Anyway, so there is a lot of support for this, which is not surprising, but good to have some of it actually in black and white. So finally, what's next? And here's where we get the whole who knows element of this, where a commitment to do employee ownership trusts without any details is, better than nothing, but still a long way from being amazing. We don't know. There was no detail in the budget in terms of what it's going to look like. Are they going to be based on the UK version? Are they going to be based on the US version? Are they going to be some combination of both, or some entirely new thing? Are they going to have tax incentives? When are we going to see them? None of those details were in. Now, to give the government full credit, this has not been exactly the easiest time for them. We have been in somewhat regular communication with them, and we know they, in the lead up to the budget was the trucker rally and Russia, Ukraine. And so there's a lot of stuff that would have put this item, which would be number 197 on their list, they just might not have got to it in the way that they would have wanted to. So we still believe them to be genuine in their interest in this. From my own personal experience on two files, one being, the fight to provide commercial rent relief to business owners in the early days of the pandemic in 2020, and the recent efforts to improve charitable laws so that charities can work more with nonprofits. Both of those things, when the legislation came out, was far worse than anyone expected. And so over the course of 2020, I spent a lot of time trying to get the government to improve what was initially a very bad rent relief program that only improved, sort of October, November of that year. when the initial thing was put in place, I think sometime in May. So there's still a chance that this could come out and be meaningless, right? So because a poorly designed plan will have no impact. So we're still working hard to try to influence. I think and I'll go back to it, there was some nod in the budget language that the government will continue to engage with stakeholders to finalize the development of rules for the EOT and assess remaining barriers to the creation of these trusts. We don't know what that means. We don't know what that looks like in terms of, so it may be that this comes out and we find out about it the same time everybody else does. So that's on the table as well. Our best guess is that if there is legislation on this, it will be either in the two fall economic items, which is the second implementation act for the budget. The first one is just underway right now, or the fall economic statement, which is sort of November and December. And these are all terms I'm learning, new for the first time. This is not my background at all. And if it slips past that, it's probably next year's budget. And if it slips past that, it means it's probably not going to happen. For whatever reason, it got pumped off the list. So I guess I say there's a lot of unknowns. I'm here to present an update on this stuff, and I end with who knows. But there's been a lot of positive development. Obviously, I'm being a little bit, over the top here in the way I'm presenting this. But I should just say, we are excited, but cautious about what it might look like. Finally, I'll just this bit on the right, the things that we've been advocating for. One is a new trust that makes it simple for people to understand what it is they're supposed to do and how it works. Two, the removal of tax barriers, which also means the addition of some tax incentives, so that this becomes a very palatable thing for owners to do when they have other options. And third, a regulatory oversight framework to ensure that this benefits employees and doesn't end up being sort of a tax dodge of some kind. I mean, there is concern among government and for us, given what our mission is, that you bring into place something that ends up being abused. Well, we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And what are the different regulations you need to make sure that doesn't happen? So that's sort of the things we've been advocating at SEP. So I've rushed through that. Why don't I stop there, and leave lots of time for questions. And that's me stopping there.
Thank you so much for that, John. You've opened up all kinds of cans of discussion. It's interesting, you ask a lawyer a question and they'll say that depends. And yet in your case, the question is, who knows? Right?
Yes.
However,
yes.
I will ask a few questions that have come up here. One is in regards to the trust itself. Why is getting the shares for free important from your perspective?
Well, it depends what you want this to be, right? So in the US and the UK, the reason why there are tax incentives associated with them is that the result of an employee ownership trust is broadening of wealth to people who don't otherwise have access. If you make people pay for shares, you are excluding a whole host of people. And so if you think about some of the most successful, most interesting outcomes in the US, you'd point to Publix, the 200,000 employee grocery chain in the Southeast US, and you'd point to some of the grocery clerks who have retired with $1 million in their ESOP account. That would never have happened. They would have had zero in their ESOP account had they had to buy their shares. And so, the reason why people are interested in this is because of its outcomes. If you force people to pay for their shares, then you don't have those outcomes. It's as simple as that. So it's a matter of accessibility.
I can see that, especially in some of those businesses where they may be minimum wage or minimal wage people who have all kinds of other responsibilities. Okay, so if the government were to go through with this and allow this to happen, but if it's not ideally the way you wanted it, are there further steps that you would take? You talked about a combined UK, USA. So what would be further steps if it doesn't shake out the way you'd like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on exactly how it shook out, but certainly there are steps. So what happened in the case of the charities, and frankly, in the case of rent relief, is that if things came out that didn't accomplish the goals that we set out for them, we just say it's bad and we advocate for change. And so right now what's happened, so just a very brief, and again, this is stuff that I'm learning for the first time, or at least, relatively new to. There is a senator called Aratna Omidvar, and she put together a bill to improve the way charities are considered by the Canada Revenue Agency, and allow charities to interact more with nonprofits. It was very well received. It had bipartisan support. So, it was probably going to become law, and then the government put it into the budget, and then the government just came out with their first budget implementation bill, which came out with rules that were very different from her program. And so she said, this is terrible, and brought a whole bunch of stakeholders to Ottawa to start to advocate for them to change it before it becomes law. And I think that's going reasonably well. So there, it becomes harder for sure if it comes out poorly structured. But those are the types of things we could still do at that time.
And at least it's a start in that way.
Yeah. Well, and again, it really depends on what it looks like. I mean, it might be an obvious first step toward a better, program later on. In that case, we'd say, great. Like, how do we work on improving it? So it really depends on what specifically it ends up being. So it depends. See there, Dan, I've done the whole it depends thing for you.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question, which is actually a bunch of questions. So we'll start into it. So in the UK and the US, are the trusts buying the shares from the owners, or are they from Treasury, or both?
Yeah, great question. So in both cases, it's from the owners. So what happens is the trust buys the shares from the owner, funded by debt that the company takes on. Right. So there's in the US, it's quite complicated. In the UK, it's not so complicated how to get the shares to the trust, but that's mechanics that we probably don't need to get into. But the net result is the shares are owned by the trust on behalf of employees in both countries. The debt is taken on by the company itself, and the owner either gets paid whatever debt has been raised by third parties, and then provides the rest of the debt themselves to the company. In terms of when the employees leave, in the UK, nothing happens, because the UK is structured as a trust which owns the shares on behalf of all employees. And then every year, profit sharing, a dividend, is paid out to employees. So they have no residual claim on those shares at all. When they leave, they get nothing. They just would have received benefit along the way. In the US, it's structured as a retirement plan, an actual registered retirement plan under ERISA, their Retirement Act legislation, which brings all sorts of complexity. So what happens there is when an employee leaves, they get paid by the company for their shares. And that payment will differ based on how long it's been since the transaction happened, based on how close they are to retirement, based on a number, how many of their shares have vested. So there's all sorts of different ins and outs in terms of how they get paid. In the US, they have over time very much improved the way they manage these trusts long-term. A few of the early ESOPs got into trouble because they didn't allocate the shares over a long enough period of time, and early employees left and caused a massive cash run on the business. They've now kind of sorted that out in terms of how these things are allocated. And when I say that, I mean in the Taylor Guitars case, for example, those shares are going to be allocated to employees over, say, 50 years. The reason for that is, again, you want to even out your obligation to employees over time. You want future employees to be able to benefit as well. You want to ensure a single employee or group of employees don't get too much of that share. All these things you do in order to make the ESOP sustainable long term. So in the case of an ESOP type structure, the employee gets nothing until they leave, and then they're paid out.
So in your mind, this is a very long-term game then. It's not simply a way for the owner to get out in a hurry, but it's a long-term game for the employees to take over. Yeah,
I mean the ideal end result of a new program would be long-lived employee-owned companies that still had the flexibility to do the right thing from a corporate perspective. Okay. So what I mean by that is, if it's a company that's, if it's a company that's in an industry that's rapidly consolidating and they're facing cost pressure, and the company needs to sell in order to, provide any value, then that company needs to sell, and that should be possible. However, if it's in a mature industry where they're things are going relatively well and they can see lasting long into the future as they exist, well, it's great that it could it could stay employee owned long term. And those are the types of things that, when we talk to government about what we hope they'll do, it's these combinations of factors that we consider in making recommendations so that we can have a long-term employee-owned structure, but retaining the flexibility of the company to do what's reasonable for that company in the market in which it operates.
Okay, thank you. So currently there are, I don't have a number, but there are hundreds and hundreds of employee-owned companies, ESOP companies in Canada now. How could this employee ownership trust potentially impact ESOPs that are already in place?
You wouldn't expect that it would, frankly. I think if a company is owned under whatever current structure it's owned under, I wouldn't expect this would affect it at all. I think all it might do is affect owner choice going forward, right? So this becomes another option for them to consider as they're looking to exit their business, and it may be more attractive, may be less attractive, depending on what they're trying to do. But I don't think the government is looking to affect current employee-owned companies at all.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here. It's about in regards to the employees not having to buy the shares. So the question is, can you address the issue of skin in the game? So this is often put forward as critical to the success of an ESOP program.
Yeah.
So how would the EOT eliminate that need of skin in the game?
There's no evidence to support the idea that skin in the game matters. Zero. It's a kind of thing that people say, but the results in the US and the UK, where they are not buying their shares, where the results are spectacularly resilient, where retention is higher, where turnover is lower, where people feel through surveys extraordinarily well connected and aligned with company objectives despite not having paid for their shares, would suggest that it's not required. What I think generally what the studies show is that communication is super important, right? Like more important than having to pay for shares is understanding what those shares mean, why they're important, what they can do for those employees, how their behavior within the company affects the value of those shares. Those are the things that really drive people's alignment and commitment to the company. And there are lots of stories of employees who have skin in the game, effectively, who have bought their shares, and then things have gone badly. And because they've paid for those shares, there's a whole other negative aspect to that program. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not required. And so there will be companies where that will be the approach. And I've had a company where that's been the approach, where we sold shares to employees under share purchase plans, et cetera. And it was good. But it's not the only way to do employee ownership.
Okay, thank you. Is there a way that, or have you considered, could a company, when they're selling to employees, could it be potentially part traditional ESOP and part employee ownership trust? Like, could it be a hybrid, for lack of better terms?
I think so. Yeah, there'd be no reason why not. The way a lot of these are structured in the US is a combination of a management incentive program and like an ESOP, or an employee ownership trust. That's super thoughtful, we think, right? The idea where you're providing management with a different set of incentives that's more standard for the industry, so you can attract the best talent and pay a competitive wage and bonus, combined with an ESOP, makes a lot of sense. Could you set aside an additional amount that people can buy if they want to? I don't see why you couldn't do that. There's nothing. It depends on how it's designed. Certainly, we haven't suggested anything that would say you can't do that, and I can't see any reason why anyone would just prevent it. It's not what I haven't seen. So I've seen the management incentive plans alongside ESOPs. I haven't seen a lot of share purchase plans alongside ESOPs. For reasons that you might understand, because if you're getting shares anyway, are you going to buy shares? But that doesn't mean it's not possible. The other part about it is in the UK, you're seeing a lot of these new EOTs be 51% EOTs and 49% both management and owner, and in often cases, the management would have bought those shares for cash. So I think there's any number of combinations that are possible depending on how it's structured.
That's the beauty about this, is possibly the flexibility and how it can help everyone. So here's a real political question, John.
Great.
It says the budget was won before Justin sold his soul to the NDP. The unions influenced both the Liberals and the NDP. So is this going to stall the good idea?
Look, maybe. I don't think so. The NDP. So we met with one member of the NDP who was a big fan of this idea. Bernie Sanders is a big fan of this in the U.S. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez has come out in support of it. There's a very left-wing guy in Canada who specifically said, "I just want to make sure in this." He was attacking the NDP for having, given up their principles. So they were the ones selling his soul in his argument. And he was saying, we want to make sure we keep the EOT. So this is not a right of center idea. And there's no reason for it to be stalled by that agreement, but who knows? And there's no reason for the unions to stall it either. I mean, there are unions in the U.S. that are there are ESOP companies in the U.S. with unions where the union members are also members of the ESOP. There's no reason for the unions to decide that this is something that a hill they're gonna die on.
Okay. What would be some of the tax benefits that you think would be good for us? Some of the changes that could happen here in Canada.
In both the US and the UK, there are capital gains tax benefits. In the UK, it's entirely deferred. It's entirely eliminated on sale to employee ownership trust, assuming it's 100%. In the US, it's deferred in a way that you can eliminate it over time, and probably half the people choose to do it that way. In the US, there are also some benefits for the company. So one of the things they're trying to do there is ensure that the company has enough cash flow in order to pay off the debts that they have in the early going. We think that's a good idea, at least a short-term benefit for the company. Those are the ones that we know of that work. And we're hopeful it'll be some version of those, but we're not sure.
Okay, because we currently have, the lifetime capital gains exemption, which is a great take for us here in Canada too. So we wouldn't want to lose that.
You don't. I mean, this is like I say, the 197th. Like, this is not going to affect the current. I mean, I would be shocked if this affected the capital gains tax incentive, because that gets distributed among far more than just the majority owners of Canadian-owned companies. There are also a lot of other people that benefit from that. So I would be shocked if this affected that. However, whatever that's up to now in the 900,000 range is, the average employee-owned company in the US is 200 employees. In the UK, it's 90 employees. That $1 million is not going to cover this for the companies that we think will end up converting. So we're hopeful it doesn't just end there, but certainly it wouldn't affect the existence of that for everybody now.
So these boats, the government boats, they turn very, very slowly. You've said, who knows? But in your mind, from the work that you've done, could you even guess, do you think we'll see something here in a year or 2 years?
We hope so. I think if it goes past a year, then something bad has happened. Right. I think it's on the agenda. It was, the Prime Minister's office had a small and medium-sized business, a press release right after the budget. This was on there. So for it to go past the next budget would mean something has gone off the rails at some point.
Okay. Well, hopefully that won't happen. And I'm assuming the work you're doing will keep it on their radar.
We hope so.
We hope so.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, look, and I know that this group in particular I'm talking to has sort of been one of the only sources of employee ownership in Canada for the last 20 or 30 years, alongside the Ellis Dons and Friesens, etc. And that's wonderful work. And our objective here is that this will be additive and provide a new and exciting vehicle for owners to use when looking to do these kinds of things. They will not only choose those in the same way they don't only choose ESOPs or EOTs ESOPs in the US or EOTs in the UK, but we're certainly excited to add to the work that's already being done.
Okay, thank you. So in the last few minutes that we have left here, John, I mean, this has been so informative. I'm just curious if you have any words of wisdom, advice about, what do we as people who believe in this model, what can we do to help advance this?
So it never hurts to write to those that are making decisions to say, this has been a powerful model that you think people will use, and the types of things that you think would help make it work, right? So there's Michael Sabia and Chrystia Freeland, who are the primary people to write. If you want to provide that level of advocacy, that actually does matter. They care. And so, anyone who wants to do that can reach out or not reach out or just do it. What I have learned is they actually read that stuff, or somebody has to read it, right? And if it's on something that is of interest to those folks, it'll get passed along. So a note that talks about people's individual experience, what they know and what they've seen, what they think would be valuable, can matter. And the two people are Sabia and Freeland.
Thank you very much for that, John. It's interesting, as an association, we've had an advocacy committee sort of on the table on the side because we didn't know that was a place that we wanted to put any effort or time. And yet, for those of you who are at the conference here, keep your eyes on your emails because there will be an annual general meeting coming up of the association fairly soon. So if this advocacy is something that would interest you, join in. We're always looking for some people to help with things like this. And John, I'm sure that we'll be in close contact with you over the next while and over the next year to help keep moving this forward.
Yeah, listen, that would be great. In the U.S., there are a number of organizations that continue to advocate for employee ownership of all forms at both the state level and the national level. So that type of advocacy is valuable and welcome, and couldn't come soon enough.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, John, so much. I don't see any other questions here that you haven't answered already. So we just really appreciate you for all of the work that you and the Social Capital Partners have been doing and to support this model. And we'll just keep moving forward with it and keep clapping our hands when you're moving forward with your work as well.
Well, thanks, Dan. I did see one around the limit to the amount that could be owned by the trust. Was that a question that I saw that we didn't answer?
You probably did, and I might have missed it. So go ahead and answer that.
Well, it's gone now, but I think what it was, and anyone can put it back in if I get this wrong. But we would expect that if there are tax incentives, they will be associated with a minimum amount that will be owned by the trust. So the way it works in the UK is, in order to get any amount of capital gains tax exemption, 51% of the company needs to be owned by the employee ownership trust after the transaction. And I think if it's 51%, you get a 51% exemption. It's 100%, you get 100% exemption. The US, that number is 30%. So we would expect there to be a bottom limit. What we wouldn't expect is from a putting the tax aside, if somebody decided, what we want to do is create a 5% employee ownership trust and build it over time, and we don't care about the tax exemption, we expect that would be allowed as well. And this question that just came on is incredibly important, which I'm a little bit upset at myself for not having mentioned. The reason why so there's all sorts of successful co-ops in the world. They are often associated with a wealth and equality focus, etc. But we're all ex-private sector people here at Social Capital Partners, and we just couldn't, frankly, get our heads around scaling co-ops across the country. The management challenge becomes too great for many companies. Some companies maybe, but you can't. To be intellectually honest, you can't say every company in Canada should become a co-op. So what we like about both of these models in the US and the UK is that the governance of the companies largely don't change. So a trustee becomes the representative of the trust. They do have some impact on how the board is organized over time, but by and large, the governance of the company stays exactly as it was. So usually there's a thoughtful transition that's been put in place, and it's not, employees don't vote on what the company should be doing. There may be some scenarios like a sale of the company where they do get a vote, but generally they don't vote on what the company does every day. So like Publix in the US, it ticks along, run by professional management. And it is our view that that is the most scalable option for Canada as well. I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense, John. And I think that probably answers the other question that just came up on the board as well.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's what I was responding to.
Right on. Well, thank you very, very much for that. And again, we really appreciate you. And I guess we can, if anybody has more questions, they can reach out to you personally. Are you going to be at the Ask the Expert session here in a moment?
I won't be, but
Okay.
I'll put my email address here in the chat and happy to talk to anyone